Hello, my name is Mark Pugh, and I'm really excited to be a part of the Case Management Society of America Oklahoma chapter's session webinar series in 2020. And the subject I'm going to be talking about in trends in opioids and medical marijuana. I had the great benefit of being with the CMSA Oklahoma in 2018. This year's a little bit different in that it's being virtual. But I really appreciate the opportunity to come back. I'm still Senior Vice President of Product Development and Marketing for Preferred Medical, and have been on the front lines in regards to the overprescribing of opioids since 2003. I've been talking about and writing about and researching academically medical cannabis since 2014. Been talking about the biopsychosocial treatment model since 2011. So had a long history over the past 2 decades. To talk about this particular subject. And so I'm excited to bring this to you guys now. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to talk first about opioids and the epidemic and just bring you up to speed. There's been a lot of things that have happened recently that's important to understand, that's feeding into the overall accountability associated with the opioid epidemic. But let me first talk about how we got here. So in the mid-1990s, there were 4 things that happened. They were not strategic in nature at the time that they happened, but looking back on it, they really were connected in more ways than one. So at the beginning of that, the first thing that happened was really doctors were being accused of undertreating pain, and that accusation came from patients, it came from policymakers, it came from their own associations. Now, keep in mind that the roller coaster ride in regards to prescribing of painkillers has been on and off again for a long time. Before the mid-1990s, doctors were accused of over-treating pain and over-prescribing opioids. But at this particular point in time, doctors were accused of under-treating pain and not using all the tools in their armamentarium to be able to address pain management. And so there were a lot of people complaining about it. At the same time, that big opioid pharma, different than big pharma, which has definitely extended the life expectancy of human beings and allowed us to deal with and treat and even overcome very difficult and challenging chronic disease. But big opioid pharma has a different approach to it, and that was really led by Purdue Pharma and the efforts that they had. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit in regards to maybe the mismarketing, which is what they've been alleged to do. In regards to the magic pill that they had come up with, OxyContin, and sold to a bunch of people, basically using a letter to the editor of an observation of inpatient hospitalizations, that there was very limited potential of addiction. Now you can imagine in that controlled situation, it was not random controlled trial. It was not any kind of gold standard clinical studies. It was just a letter to the editor, but that was used by a lot of different people, including Purdue Pharma, allegedly, to talk in terms of their the drug that they were coming out with that had no possibility or low possibility addiction. So we had doctors accused of undertreating pain at the same time as big opioid pharma came and said, hey, we got the magic pill for that. The third thing was pain as the 5th vital sign. As clinicians, y'all know that pain is completely subjective. Just common sense means pain is completely subjective. We know that everybody has different levels of pain threshold. But back in the mid-1990s, this was added to a lot of different mechanisms through JCO, the American Medical Association, and saying we need to ask on a scale of 1 to 10 on frowny face to smiley face, what's your level of pain? And we need to treat that just as sacrosanctly as your heart rate in regards to how to develop treatment plans associated with it. Interestingly, in 2016, the AMA and JCO both backed off of that and said there were some unintended consequences from asking that. Not that pain, knowing the level of pain is irrelevant. It absolutely is relevant to the treatment, but it's not objective, and it really should not have been treated as the 5th vital sign. And so they had backed off of that. So then the fourth thing that happened in this particular time frame was press gaining patient satisfaction surveys, the Yelp of medical care. And so there were a lot of people that were using that to game the system. And there is a lot of evidence that doctors were actually their approach to treatment and their approach to patients and what they would give and what they would not give was oftentimes geared towards making sure that they got positive responses on those patient satisfaction surveys. whether that be, the impact on their compensation, potentially their ability to rise in the ranks to medical director. A lot of different things were coming into play, and there's a lot of science that shows that doctors actually changed their treatment patterns and changed their behavior based on making sure that they got good patient satisfaction survey results. So all those things, again, they were not launched strategically. There was nobody behind the curtain that said all these things should be done at the same time. But in retrospect, it's pretty easy to see that they all happened about the same time, and they really fed in to the opioid epidemic. Now, you look at the CDC documentation, and they have documented 3 clear waves of the opioid epidemic. One surefire way that I can tell if somebody really hasn't been paying attention and just been reading the headlines for articles is that they say now that the opioid epidemic is related to the overprescribing of painkillers. Granted, in my opinion, there are still too many opioids and too many benzodiazepines and too many muscle relaxants and too many antidepressants and et cetera, that are being prescribed for pain. But the real issue right now is not that. Now, it was at the beginning, that first wave that started in, again, the mid-1990s. CDC started their graph in 1999, where there were too many prescription opioids being prescribed, and it was causing significant harm to people that were taking them as prescribed, and then also those that were not taking them as prescribed or stealing them from medicine cabinets, et cetera. But it's interesting as prescribing patterns changed and people, especially patients, became more aware of potential dangers, then the second wave arose, which is the rise of heroin. Now, this is not the junkies that you're maybe used to back in the 60s and 70s. These are attorneys, these are moms, these are claims adjusters, these are healthcare providers, preachers, just anybody that you can think of that unfortunately transitioned to heroin. And then a third wave happened in 2013, which was the rise of synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl. It's not the fentanyl that you see used during childbirth, but it's the fentanyl that's oftentimes in the analogs that are manufactured in China and then shipped to the United States Postal Service, UPS, FedEx, across the southern border, and has infected a lot of different people and a lot of different deaths. And so I'm going to go over some numbers in a little bit, but as you pay attention to the opioid epidemic, it has had those 3 distinct waves. And not that heroin issue is over, not that that there isn't still overprescribing of opioids, but really the predominant killer when it comes to opioid epidemic right now is the fentanyl and the fentanyl analogs. So I put some numbers up here and some links. More than welcome to share the PowerPoint as a PDF in case you're interested in clicking on this. But the 157 is Dr. Barry Schultz, and that's the number of years that he's serving in prison for prescribing one patient 23,000 oxycodone pills in an 8-month period. So wrap your head around one individual getting 23,000 oxycodone pills in 8 months. You can kind of understand why this doctor, who didn't really show much remorse in this particular interview, is serving 157 years in prison. The 270, 85, and 572 million should be very relevant and understood by Oklahomans. This was the 270 million was the settlement by Purdue Pharma with the state of Oklahoma in March of 2019. The 85 million is the settlement by Teva Pharmaceuticals in June of 2019. And then Johnson & Johnson decided to segregate themselves from those other two, and they kind of paid a little bit more than they had anticipated, 572 million, which came in an actual judgment against them in August of 2019. So Oklahoma's got a bunch of money, close to $1 billion in regards to settlements from these manufacturers for everything that happened. Speaking of billions, the $26 billion is the latest settlement proposal by McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen, which are the primary intermediaries or distributors of the opioids. Interestingly enough, this time last year, they were offering a settlement of $18 billion, and the various cities, municipalities, counties, states that were part of the lawsuits said that's not enough. So I don't know if this is the final number or not, but as of early November, $26 billion is their latest offer. 430,000 is a big number as well. That's the number of people that died since 2000. That was alleged by the Ohio counties of Lake and Trumbull, and they alleged that CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, Walmart, and Giant Eagle all contributed to that. So we've gone from the physician Dr. Schultz, to the manufacturers, to the intermediaries, the distributors, to the pharmacies themselves, and then now Purdue Pharma. They just pled guilty to 3 criminal charges in relation to their mismarketing of OxyContin specifically. There are 3 felony counts of criminal wrongdoing. Interestingly enough, their executives are not exempted from ongoing civil liability associated with that, but they are finally coming to the table. And if you look at a lot of the evidence that was presented, that Purdue Pharma knew exactly what was going on with their OxyContin. They knew exactly how addictive it was, and they still pushed it through that. I think they saw the writing on the wall, and certainly they have pled guilty. So there's a variety of accountability that's going on with the opioid epidemic. So what are the current trends? Well, if you look at the numbers, the way CDC calculates fatalities is a rolling 12 months. So the latest one is January 2020, so basically most of 2019. There were 50,704 opioid deaths, or 139 per day. Now, as you can see, the green line is the oxycodone, the hydrocodone. So those are the prescription opioids. And you can see there's still way too many. There's 11,096 deaths from that. So even one is too many from that. But you can see it's somewhat plateaued and evened off over time over the past 4 years. But you can see fentanyl, as I mentioned, that third wave, that brown, has risen dramatically, and it is on the uphill climb. There's 41,592 deaths specifically associated with fentanyl. So when you talk about 139 people per day, that's a lot of people every day that are still dying from various parts of the opioid epidemic. And then we've got COVID on top of all this stuff. Thank you, 2020. So we got the COVID pandemic that's leading to a lot of misuse and overuse of alcohol. A lot of prescription opioids, prescription drugs in general, and illicit drugs that are being misused and abused, and suicide. The calls to suicide hotlines have dramatically increased. And so what we've seen is, even though with the number of deaths that we had in 2020, that was actually a decline. We've made some progress in regards to the overall numbers in regards to that. Unfortunately, we're reversing some of that progress by COVID and people going into shelter in place and being isolated and suffering from anxiety and depression, from unemployment, from losing their business, from food insecurity, just relational issues, not being able to say goodbye to grandma or grandpa that were dying from basically depression, isolation, and nursing homes. And all that's compounded on top of the 250,000 people that actually have died from the disease of COVID. So COVID has increased this tremendous amount of despair, of anxiety, of depression, of helplessness associated with that. And that has really, unfortunately, reversed some of the positive trends that we had seen in addressing the opioid epidemic, because people are reaching out for some form of self-medication, regardless of what that might be. So when we talk about opioids, I never want anybody to ever leave any of my presentations to think that Mark said that opioids are bad and never should be prescribed. No, that's not the case. We went from one extreme to the other. So we started with the extreme of handing them out like candy in the mid-1990s to anybody and everybody, dentists, vets, orthopods, general practitioners, anybody and everybody. If you had some kind of pain, here's a 30-day supply for pain that may last 2 or 3 days. Just made no sense whatsoever back in the day. And then the pendulum has swung with, doctors being incarcerated and DA looking over their shoulders and patients being more informed about their care and about the options available to them. And then the pendulum swung such that a lot of doctors don't want to prescribe opioids whatsoever. And in fact, unfortunately, I've read a lot of stories where doctors are actually saying, I'm not going to prescribe any opioids. And that means you, that patient that has been taking them for 15 years, just going to drop them like a hot potato. No advice on weaning, no advice on tapering, no kind of, hey, you want to go and take a look at detox or functional restoration or look at a PM&R doc. None of that. They basically just say, see ya, I'm done with this. I just don't want to do it. So somewhere in the middle is a balance between overprescribing and under or no prescribing, which is the appropriate use of opioids. And there is appropriate use, official disability guidelines, ACOM guidelines, Colorado, Louisiana, New York, California, variety of work comp guidelines, CDC guidelines, the VA guidelines. None of them say never ever prescribe opioids. What they all say is it's a focus on function. It's a focus on evaluating the risk versus the benefits. That can be in the acute phase. That can be even in the chronic phase. So we've got some evidence from California, specifically the California Work Comp Institute, that shows a big switch in the use of opioids versus NSAIDs, anti-inflammatory. And you can see the script is essentially flipped. And it really broke even back in 2015, which is when the paths crossed. And so we're seeing a tremendous influx of the use of NSAIDs. Now, obviously, NSAIDs have some downsides too. The longer you use it, the more potential ulcer issues and kidney and liver issues, especially from an overdosage standpoint. But certainly from an acute standpoint, there's a lot of evidence that shows the use of ibuprofen, the use of acetaminophen, and those kinds of drugs have at least similar analgesia to opioids with a lot less risks and side effects associated with that. So the industry from work comp standpoint has made that transition in large part to that. So naproxen, meloxicam, Celebrex, diclofenac, I did some study. Preferred Medical, my employer, is a pharmacy benefit manager and ancillary services provider. So we've got some data, and I looked at 2019 data. And it's interesting when I looked at NSAIDs specifically, that NSAIDs declined by more than half from year 1 of the claim to year 4 of the claim. So we see that transition that the NSAIDs are used early on, in the early onset of the claim, in the early onset of pain. And then as the claim continues on, the NSAID use declines quite rapidly. Now, hopefully what is being done is those NSAIDs are not being replaced by opioids, but are being replaced by other treatment alternatives, which I'm going to talk about. Benzodiazepines, we've had an epidemic of that for a long time. In fact, when I first started looking at prescription opioids back in 2003, one of the things I almost always saw when there was an overprescribing of opioids, there oftentimes was an overprescribing of benzos as well as Xanax, Valium. Very, very dangerous, very complex. PharmD that I worked with several years ago on a weaning program said that the very last drug classification that you should take into account when you're going through a weaning process is the benzos. You should wean opioids, you should wean everything else, and then the benzos, because the side effects, the withdrawal process is almost more dangerous than the opioids, and they're very complex from a psychosocial standpoint. So there's a lot of important knowledge about that, and not necessarily substituting, even though we have seen the substitution oftentimes of benzos for opioids, that may be trading one evil for another. Back on the preferred medical data, I noticed that benzodiazepines tripled from year 1 of claim to year 4 of claim. So that's going the opposite direction, right? They're increasing in that. Now, certainly benzodiazepines can be used for peripheral neuropathy, and that can certainly be a chronic condition, but you definitely need to be aware of the risks associated with that. And then gabapentinoids, the Lyrica, the Neurontin, they historically have been in the top 5 in both usage and financial cost in workers' comp for the last decade plus. Now, obviously, Lyrica's got its own generic that came out earlier this year, and that is going to have an impact on the cost, but they're still utilized a lot. And oftentimes, they have been used in replacement of opioids, which could be a good thing. They don't have the necessary side effects or the risks associated with opioids or benzodiazepines, but they're not necessarily risk-free. And a lot of that we can tell from them becoming drugs of abuse. And the reason, the way that you can tell that a drug is a drug of abuse is that it has a street value. And there is a street value for pregabalin and especially gabapentin. And that comes from them accentuating the high from an opioid. So people will take a heroin or take a oxy that they bought on the street, or fentanyl or anything like that, and they take a gabapentin or pregabalin, which accentuates the high euphoria. And so the United Kingdom made both of these drugs a Class C, which is the equivalent of Schedule 5, back in April of 2019. There's a variety of states, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Michigan, and Virginia, that also have it as a Schedule 5. associated with that. Lyrica is already a Schedule 5. So I can see as we understand gabapentinoids a little bit more and understand their street value and understand a little bit more about what's happening with them from a drug abuse standpoint, we're going to start seeing those Schedule 5s move down to Schedule 4, Schedule 3, maybe even Schedule 2 at some point, because you know, they're not completely devoid of risk. Less risk than opioids, less risk than benzos for sure, and certainly have tremendous help from a peripheral neuropathy kind of approach and condition associated with that. It's helped a lot of people, but it's not devoid of risks for sure. So we've seen a rise in addition to the switch to NSAIDs and the switch to these other alternatives like benzos and NSAIDs and gabapentinoids, alternative non-pharma treatment like yoga and Tai Chi and acupuncture and dry needling and mindfulness apps and massage therapy and aromatherapy, music therapy, deep diaphragmatic breathing, teaching people better nutrition, teaching people to become addicted to exercise, teaching people how to hydrate properly. So all of these things are oftentimes are treatments that are done to them or treatment that people can do for themselves. But there's a lot of evidence, for example, in mindfulness and meditation that is very conducive to pain management. Acupuncture just recently, earlier this year, was admitted to be acceptable by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, for up to 12 treatments, and then another 8 treatments if necessary if it was working. But they said that the science is clear that acupuncture really helps chronic low back pain. And think about it from work comp standpoint, that certainly could contribute to a lot of different claims we're talking about. Psychotherapy is another big aspect of non-pharmaceutical alternatives for pain management. That includes cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, motivational interviewing, biofeedback, a variety of different tools associated with helping the brain figure out how to manage the pain. If you're not familiar with neuroplasticity, I recommend that you Google that and understand a little bit better. It's basically, to simplify it, it's the ability for the brain to biologically, chemically, it's always laying down new neural pathways, both positive and negative, from the moment that you're born until the moment that you die. And managing those new neural pathways, you might want to call it habits, but managing that process so that you have a better perception of pain. You better can internalize a locus of control and recognize that you can actually manage the pain yourself through a variety of self-management tools. So psychotherapy is really important to help train the brain into managing the pain, because in reality, the pain does not become pain until it hits the brain. Literally does not become pain until it hits the brain. So it's really important to understand the filters, the prejudices, the biases, everything that's happened to you up to this point that influences how your brain perceives pain, and then focus on adjusting that to be a more positive approach. Virtual reality therapy is really an evolving tool. I happen to be on the advisory board for a company called Harvard MedTech, which does virtual reality therapy, and I've gotten to learn a lot more about that. I've actually got my own headset. The concept of immersion, the concept of distraction, the concept of joy and escape. There's a lot of science behind virtual reality and how it helps pain management, both acute and chronic, how it helps from PTSD, a variety of different options, and it can be an alternative to opioids for sure. And certainly there are no risk effects. There's no side effects or risks necessarily virtual reality therapy that certainly are associated with prescription drugs. Interdisciplinary pain management is another approach. It's been around for a long time, the concept of an MD and a DO with a licensed psychologist, typically behavioral psychologist, and a licensed physical therapist that are dealing with the whole person. That's a really important key to pain management. Telemedicine, as you know, has been a big thing in COVID in regards to adoption of telemedicine and the willingness and ability to take treatment, even PT treatment over the phone, or I say phone, over the computer. And so telemedicine is a big part of that. And one aspect of telemedicine that's really great is it can make it much more convenient for people to take part of treatment, and that convenience will increase compliance. So rather than having to take a full day or a half day out of work and commute through traffic just to get to your PT visit, instead, you can spend 30 minutes in front of a computer with not hands-on, but video with a licensed physical therapist, that they're evaluating the way that you're moving, taking electronic measurements of range of motion, doing video chat, providing videos, just a lot of stuff. Fortunately, one of the side effects or silver linings from COVID is that we have relaxed a lot of regulations in society, in general healthcare and workers' compensation when it comes to telemedicine. And I'm hopeful, I'm confident that those relaxations are not going to go away because providers like the increased capacity to see more patients, and patients definitely like the increased convenience of that. And then in general, the advocacy claims model, the concept that we're dealing with the whole person, not just the biomedical model, but opening ourselves up to recognizing that the psycho, the social, the other aspects of being a human being are key aspects to pain management. And ultimately, at the end of the day, from an injured worker standpoint, workers' compensation, our goal is to get them back to function, to get them back to life, and to restore to them as much as possible their life as it was previous to that. And so taking everything into account, the brain, the body, the whole 9 yards, the enablers, the support system, the social fabric that you're part of, all that's really important to that. So as we look at pain management from a holistic standpoint, we've seen a tremendous movement over time from just throwing opioids at it to opening our minds and our hearts, and most importantly, our pocketbooks, to alternatives to that really have a lot of evidence behind it. And so that really gets to that whole kind of biopsychosocial spiritual treatment model, the recovery mindset, and helping people focus on recovery of function. And that may or may not include work. If you've been out of work for a long time, the longer you're out of work, obviously, the statistics show that the longer you're out of work, the less likely you are to go back to work. So having a return to work mindset up front is really important, but sidling that with the ability to think in terms of, I want to get back to how I was. I want to be able to shop for groceries. I want to be able to go out on hikes with my kids. I want to be able to X, Y, and Z. And having that recovery mindset, that attitude associated with it. And again, the neuroplasticity, how important the brain is, and understanding how important the brain is when you're dealing with these particular aspects of pain management. And I know, people historically were definitely afraid of cognitive behavioral therapy, especially when I first started talking about it in 2011, 2012, because they were afraid that psych was going to be a compensable diagnosis. But my argument was that if you don't address the whole person, you're going to have suboptimal outcomes. So it's kind of like that old Fram commercial, if you're old enough to remember that, pay me now or pay me later. So taking effect and understanding the importance of the brain and the attitude is really important. And the beliefs, the attitudes behind that. You can sit and feel sorry for yourself and say, I'm depressed and sad and hurt and confused, etc. Or you can say, I'm fine. It's all about a positive attitude. And releasing the negative attitudes, and releasing maybe those that are fostering the negative attitudes around you, and turning it right around, turning it from a glass half empty to a glass half full approach. That's really important to the biopsychosocial. And then the behavior that comes from that, better choices, better thought patterns. So eating better, more nutritious foods, being fully hydrated on a daily basis, getting your exercise, doing the different things, stretching exercises, doing what you got to do in order to make sure that you're available for the day. Another key component is sleep. Sleep deprivation is a really, really dangerous adjunct to bad pain management. Now, I recognize if you're in pain, sometimes sleep is hard to come by, especially good, solid, consecutive sleep as opposed to the fits and starts. But it's really important to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep every night. To get that REM sleep, to get that deep sleep, to get even that light sleep, because all of that is flushing toxins from the brain that have accumulated throughout the day. It moves short-term memory into long-term memory. It basically gets your brain ready for the next day. And the less sleep you get, the less ready you are. And obviously, the less sleep you get, the more pain there becomes, and the more intense the pain is. And so it's really important to figure out some ways, shape or form, proper sleep hygiene to help get good sleep. So in workers' compensation, I think healthcare in general, and just common sense for people that are around, we have understood that there is a better way, a more holistic way to take care of pain than just popping pills. Popping pills will help in some cases, and I'm not discounting the fact that for some people, medications are absolutely necessary, and they are pretty much the only way that they can have function. But there's a lot of people still that take way too many pills that really should adopt some of these other approaches to pain management. So now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about weed. November 3rd was a big day in regards to marijuana around the country. I've been talking about and writing about and researching academically the cannabis issue in workers' comp and society in general since 2014. So I've had, like with opioids, where I was talking and writing about it and trying to inform people and educate about it before most everybody else in work comp. There weren't many people talking about cannabis in 2014 in workers' compensation. There were people in general society, normal, MPP, there are a variety of different advocates for it, but 2014 was a big year of change. There were a lot of states that passed medical cannabis programs. There was the Greg Villalpando case in New Mexico that required reimbursement for medical cannabis for an injured worker. So there's a lot of stuff that happened in 2014. So the timing was that I caught it early on and recognized, hey, wait a minute, not only is this a great source of dad jokes, but it's going to be something significant that workers' compensation, society in general, employers are all going to have to wrestle with. And the truth has come out to that. So November 3rd, again, was a big voting day for a variety of different reasons. But for cannabis, we've got 5 new states now that have adopted more marijuana. Arizona, South Dakota, Montana, and New Jersey all legalized recreational marijuana. Mississippi and South Dakota both legalized medical marijuana. Interestingly, on those 2 points, Mississippi chose the more robust version of the Amendment 65A that has qualifying conditions. So they had 2 different options, and the voters in Mississippi voted to take the more robust example of that. And for South Dakota, there has never been a state up to this point that has legalized both recreational and medical marijuana at the same time. South Dakota is the first state to ever do that. Every other state that has adopted some form of recreational marijuana did so only after legalizing medical marijuana. And that's why when you hear people that aren't fans of cannabis start arguing against legalization of medical marijuana, they say that's just the camel's nose under the tent. Well, you could certainly make the case that once you legalize medical marijuana, you're well on your way towards probably legalizing recreational marijuana. The only holdouts right now are those red states, Idaho, Nebraska, and Kansas. And chances are really good that they're not going to hold out very long because there's revenue options and there's peer pressure because every state around them, including Canada north of Idaho, and Mexico, probably sometime in 2021, have legalized recreational marijuana. So there's a lot of peer pressure associated with taking advantage of this huge green rush that's going on. And NORML, if you're familiar with NORML, you recognize the pun. They have been working overtime for a couple of decades to try to normalize people's attitudes about marijuana. And if you look at these statistics, that they've been pretty good at the outcome. Now, obviously, if you look at the source of this, the Fair and Just Prosecution Justice Collaborative Institute Data for Progress, they obviously have a little bit of bias associated with that. But when you look at the statistics, you can see that Democrats, 69% of them agree or strongly agree that federal government should legalize the use and sale of marijuana, not medical marijuana, just marijuana in general, which obviously would include recreational marijuana. But you can see a bunch of Republicans, 54%, and independents, 41%, both agree with that as well. So we have definitely reached plurality in general. Again, if you look at the top line, which is the combination of all of them, that is 58%. That have approved of that. So we definitely have crossed the Rubicon. And then the graphic on the right-hand side, should the federal government respect the right of individual states to do what they want? And again, that horse is out of the barn already. So the subject of cannabis certainly has been normalized in greater society, and that's recognized by a variety of different things. NORML, again, the Gallup poll, which, maybe NORML, you may go, well, of course they've got a bias towards this, but Gallup has been around for several decades. And they said 70% of Americans say most smoking marijuana is morally acceptable. So wrap your head around if you were back in the 60s and 70s and looked at Cheech and Chong and watched their movie, or laughed at Jeff Spicoli and Fast Times at Ridgemont High, or remember that your high school colleagues, when I was growing up in the 70s, that we had the bullpen where all the potheads went out and smoked marijuana. Now it's morally acceptable by 70% of Americans. And Marijuana Moment, which obviously is biased, says that think marijuana legalization is a successful policy. So they have come to the point where they think that from a government standpoint, whether it be federal or state level, that it is an appropriate policy to go ahead and legalize and or decriminalize marijuana. And one of the things that you may not have noticed in all the discussion about legalization is that there's even more states that have decriminalized marijuana. And a lot of that has to do with historical racial disparities when associated with that. And so now social justice and racial justice has now come into the discussion in regards to marijuana, which you probably would not have anticipated 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. But now that's a key component and talking point that's helping drive a lot of the policy and a lot of the arguments associated with that. So we have definitely reached a majority in the United States. And when you look at the polling in regards specifically to medical marijuana, the top one is a Kentucky poll. The other 3 are national polls, but you can see it ranges from 87 to 90 to 91 to 93% of people that agree that medical marijuana should be legalized, as long as doctors recommend it. So they typically want doctors involved in it, but I can't think of anything, I can't remember anything in the history of the United States, certainly not in 2020, where 90% of us have agreed on anything. But this is pretty much unanimous at this point that medical marijuana is like a big no-brainer associated with that. And then you come to your home state of Oklahoma, where you pass marijuana, medical marijuana by 56 to 43% ratio. It's interesting that the medical marijuana sales are on pace to double 2019 numbers, so you're growing rapidly. But part of that is it's kind of a wild, wild west. And I'll read this quote from how recreational is Oklahoma's medical marijuana market. So you go, hey, we don't have recreational, we have medical marijuana. Well, you might want to reconsider. So this is a quote from it. Welcome to the Wild West of weed. 18 months after Oklahoma voters approved medical marijuana, the state is awash in cannabis retail shops. 1 in 13 adult Oklahomans has a patient card. Wrap your head around that number. With no qualifying medical conditions required, patients are finding it easy to get approval with consultations, sometimes just a video call away. So there have been a variety of states that passed medical cannabis that did so with very tight regulations. Minnesota was one state that I was following very closely, and they went from over my dead body to legalize medical marijuana in about 8 months. And how they did it was parents who had kids with some kind of epileptic seizure would bring their kids into legislative sessions. Sometimes the kids would have seizures in their wheelchairs, and the parents would argue that CBD oil that you can't get high from was the only tool that worked for them. None of the FDA-approved treatments for seizures worked for them. And so it obviously worked in front of legislatures, the different houses, and then they did the same thing in the governor. So Minnesota went from over my dead body to approval within a very short period of time, but they did so with very tight regulations. There's only 2 manufacturers and 8 dispensaries around the state. So it's very tightly controlled. New York is had kind of a wild, wild west to some degree, but there's a lot of requirements. The dispensary, I visited a dispensary in Manhattan last year, and it was very interesting, very boutique. Walked in, New York is one of a handful of states that requires a pharmacist to be involved. So as opposed to Colorado, which I visited a dispensary in Denver, and I had a bud tender who obviously was a user, help advice. I went into the dispensary and I was interested, if someone comes in with epileptic seizures, or someone comes in with Parkinson's or with chronic pain or PTSD, what do you recommend? How do you go through the trial and error process? How do you determine dosage? How do you determine duration or intensity? Or the frequency of the formulation? Is it smoking? Is it edibles? Is it tinctures? How do you do that? And the bud tender goes, dude, we just kind of figure it out as we go along, and it's kind of a trial and error process. So it's pretty much based on their personal experience, and then the patient self-selecting and trying to figure out, well, this didn't work, so maybe I'm going to try that. In New York, and again, a handful of other states, a pharmacist is involved. So there's a little bit more process, methodology associated with that, a little bit more science associated with it. Understanding, are you marijuana naive? Because if you've never smoked pot before or had an edible, you probably don't want to start with a high dosage to begin with. You need to understand the different comorbidities. So at least the pharmacist is trying to put some form and function around that. So individual states have different ways of managing medical cannabis programs. Oklahoma pretty much is like, dude, whatever. So, you know, it's difficult to put that back together. I've engaged in California a lot through this process. And California actually created the Bureau of Cannabis Control when they formally legalized recreational marijuana. And I got to know the director that led that division a good bit. And the analogy that she explained to me is it's by putting regulations around a medical marijuana industry that had grown up over 20 plus years, was like installing the cockpit on a plane that was already flying at 35,000 feet. The concept of quality control, the concept of testing, the concept of transportation and security. You know, there are a variety of different things that the guy that's just growing it in his backyard or up on a hill in Eureka and reselling it just weren't going to be able to afford. And so, you know, what California has done by virtue of these regulations is really brought in big green. You've heard of big opioids, big opioid pharma, big tobacco, big alcohol. Well, welcome to big green. There's large companies with big bucks, and they're the only ones that really can comply with those kind of regulations. So when you see one medical cannabis program in a state, you've seen one medical, that they're all completely different, except for those that have qualifying conditions oftentimes have the same qualifying conditions over and over and over again. So you see IBS, you see Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, you see PTSD and chronic pain. You know, you see a variety of these different things, glaucoma, that are repeated quite frequently through that process. So Oklahoma is going to probably have to, at some point, try to apply some kind of regulatory control over this process, because right now it seems like it's pretty much, in some degree, buyer beware in regards to that. So you might go, why are you spending a lot of time talking about medical marijuana? It ain't medicine. It just helps get people high. Well, the smartest people, smartest scientists and engineers in the United States, National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, did a meta-study of all the different materials, all the different studies, whether it be anecdote or true random controlled trials on cannabis. And they looked at all these different studies in 2017, and they found evidence to support that patients who were treated with cannabis or cannabinoids were more likely to experience a significant reduction in pain symptoms. So we've got the federal government now who, on one side, the DEA says it's Schedule I, it has no medical purpose whatsoever. It's illegal. It goes back to the 1930s with Harry Anslinger and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, where they used different aspects of media to portray that cannabis users were crazy. And if they weren't crazy to begin with, they would be if they smoked a joint. And they used that to change the perception of cannabis for a long period of time into being kind of a no-fly zone. And then, you know, it's still, and then President Nixon kind of codified that with the Controlled Substances Act in 1969, where he made it officially a part of Schedule I, which was a political decision, not a decision based on evidence or science or anything like that. It was a political decision. He just didn't like what was happening at UC Berkeley. So, you know, that was part of the Schedule I concept, and it's still Schedule I. The DEA actually was given the opportunity to evaluate, along with the FDA and NIDA, to reschedule it, to not make it Schedule I anymore back in 2016, and they decided not to. So it's still Schedule I, it's still no medical use. But on the flip side, the FDA approved Epidiolex about a year, almost 2 years ago at this point. It is a natural extract of the hemp plant. It's not synthetic like Marinol or Sesamet. It's literally hemp plant that has been gone through random control trials. It's done the the gold standard in regards to clinical trials. The FDA looks at the clinical trials and go, yes, CBD, low THC, that comes from the hemp plant that's formulated as Epidiolex can treat Dravet syndrome and another epileptic seizure syndrome associated with that. So on one hand, we say there's zero medical use by the DEA, the FDA, and NIDA. On the other side, we got the FDA that goes, well, actually the hemp plant, CBD, low THC, the science is clear that it helps epileptic seizures. And then you've got these really smart scientists and engineers that looked at all the metadata and looked at all the study results and go, you know what, there's significant evidence here that you can have a reduction in pain. And how is medical cannabis being used? Primarily to alleviate pain. And if you're not sure why or how, the endocannabinoid system is a really important concept to know. It has not been taught in medical schools, nursing schools. Physicians out there really don't understand it very much. It's relatively new. It's really only evolved from a knowledge base over the past 15 or 20 years. But we have discovered, like, you've got the mu receptor, that's the opioid receptor that the OxyContin latches onto. Well, we've got cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2 receptors. And you can see CB1 is really focused on the brain, motor activity, thinking, motor coordination, appetite, etc. The CB2 is more along the spinal cord, the nervous system, and in the gut. So you see the kidneys and the respiratory tract and the cardiovascular system. So when you see qualifying conditions like Parkinson's in the brain, epileptic seizures in the brain, IBS, you can't see it, but I'm pointing at my gut. So the CB1 and CB2 receptors are throughout our body, and they were built to accept cannabinoids, whether it be the endogenous cannabinoids that our human body creates by itself, or the external cannabinoids that comes from the cannabis plant. And so when you start piecing these things together, now all of a sudden you start, and I've heard a lot of people say there's zero science when it comes to medical use of cannabis. There's no studies that associated with that. Well, I don't think they're really paying attention, because there's growing evidence, growing science, not just anecdote. And there's powerful anecdote of people who are suffering from cancer pain, or people that are suffering from low back pain, or people suffering from, a variety of different maladies, Parkinson's. There's a really cool video by an ex-cop named Larry, who had Parkinson's, and over a 4-minute span, 1 drop of CBD oil removed the contractions of his fingers. He was able to sit up. He was able to speak intelligently that he wasn't able to before that administration of the CBD. And he had exhausted all FDA-approved treatment. There wasn't any place for him to go, and yet the CBD oil works. So there's powerful anecdote. There's involving much more science. There's a lot of science coming from Israel that's interestingly funded by American dollars. China has a lot of patents in regards to the use of cannabis. So there's growing evidence. And then when you think in terms of the endocannabinoid system, now all of a sudden you can start to connect the dots that this actually is a natural organic way of creating and establishing homeostasis, which is equilibrium amongst the body, all the different organs, the brain, the organs, et cetera, that everything's working in harmony. And in the endocannabinoid system, one of its primary, what the science says is the endocannabinoid system is one of the primary providers of homeostasis to the human body. That's really important to understand. So when somebody says there is no science that confirms that marijuana is medicinal, I have to take issue with that. Now, is there enough science to validate and without any kind of conversation or conflict or confrontation that says that it absolutely positively is a source for pain management, et cetera? I don't think you can necessarily say that either. We're kind of in that gray zone where we're still figuring it out. But I think the longer this goes and the more you understand about how the human body works, the more you can see how it does have success in that regards. So taking all that into account, when you're looking at workers' compensation, cannabis, marijuana is absolutely being used right now. Because I've spoken on this so many different times in so many different states around the country, I've had a lot of private discussions with individual payers. And some of them have been forced to involuntarily reimburse for medical marijuana by a state court, by the work comp board, a court decision, different things like that. So thou shalt reimburse for this because it's reasonable and necessary. But I've talked to a number of people who are voluntarily doing it and not being forced to do it. And a lot of it's related to the finances. Cannabis is generally cheaper than the prescription drugs, even the generic version of the prescription drugs. It's a claim closure strategy. It reduces the Medicare set aside. It reduces the financial outlay, but it also, if it facilitates the weaning of opioids and benzodiazepines and other things, and replaces the cannabis, or replaces it with the cannabis, then you can achieve a lot of savings and help close the claim. But what hasn't been figured out yet is the dosing, is the duration, is the frequency, is the formulation. Reimbursement is basically writing a blank check. It's go, okay, you figure out what works for you, and you send me the bill, right? Now that really is a little bit dangerous to some degree, because you don't know, you don't have any control over the cost, you don't have any control over the dispensary, over the quality of the product. You don't have any control as to whether they're, how they're using it, if they're sharing it with friends. You don't really understand all that stuff. You don't know, is it eat 3 brownies throughout the day? Is it hit the bong before the morning to relax you? Is it, 2 gummies to help you relax at night? What is the dosing? How many milligrams? All that different kind of stuff. There's not really a lot of guidance associated with that. And so we're going to have to figure that out, because writing blank checks, while it may be financially expedient right now, we're not really sure what the ramifications are. You want price certainty. You want to understand what you're paying for. You want to understand the quality. You understand the science behind it. It's interesting, CBD, when the Farm Bill was enacted in December of 2018, it legalized CBD, and so you can find CBD everywhere. Well, there was a study that was done, and I don't know how scientific the study was, but it showed that about 90% of samples that they took at fast food stores, nutrition stores, and different things like that, the ingredients didn't actually match what the ingredients were listed on the side of the bottle. And unfortunately, even a portion of that, there was 0 CBD in there, even though they advertised CBD. So we've created this kind of Wild West when it comes from CBD from hemp, in regards to, so it really is buyer beware, and understanding the science, understanding the ingredients, and providing some kind of utilization review. How do you assess the medical appropriateness? Is this appropriate for all of this that's going on? So, medical cannabis is here to stay. When you look at the dollars associated with it, you look at the number of states that legalized it as late as November 3rd, and there will probably be continued efforts to further legalize it and decriminalize it around the country. It's here to stay, and it's something that workers' compensation has to wrestle with very clearly. But I want to take a step back. So I've presented a lot of different options for pain management. The gold standard for pain management is an engaged and resilient patient who has created an individualized self-management technique that takes advantage of all the above. So for some people, prescription painkillers are appropriate. They work. The benefits exceed the risk. For some people, deep diaphragmatic breathing is more than sufficient, along with yoga and stretching. For other people, they're going to need acupuncture, ongoing physical therapy. For some people, cannabis is going to be an option for them. For other people, psychotherapy. For other people, X, Y, and Z. Every human being is different, and that means that their treatment plan, the way that they manage their pain, is going to have to be unique and individualized to them. So the best thing that we can do as a society, the best thing we can do as a healthcare industry, the best thing we can do as workers' compensation is create a tool belt of as many options that have science behind them that we can offer to people, and allow them, the individual, to work with their physician to figure out which of those options and combination of options work for them. So ultimately, self-efficacy is what we want. We want people to feel empowered and emboldened to be able to manage the pain themselves, preferably with nothing else. In a perfect setting, in my mind, the best way to do it is not to take anything else into your body other than good stuff like eating blueberries in the morning and drinking lots of water, and and getting exercise, and all those different things that you can do yourself that doesn't need external. But life is not perfect. This world is not perfect. And so we need to have options for everybody when it comes to that. And so that's the key. As payers, as clinicians, as individuals, we need to figure out what works for each individual and give them access to as many options as possible. I really appreciate the time and the attention and the opportunity to join CMSA again. I hope this was helpful. If we are not connected on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect there, or on my blogs or on my YouTube channel. But I very much hope and wish success to you as we come hopefully out the other side of COVID, and that as we all work towards whatever the new normal is, that we maintain our sanity through that process, and take into account all the blessings that we have accrued even with as difficult and challenging a 2020 as it's been. Thank you so much.